Hello, good evening, and welcome to today's session on BIC Streams, presented by the Art of Gold and in collaboration with ICA Cultural Resources and Research, the Mehrangarh Museum Trust, Yarn Club, and Culture Bag. Today's session is a luminous presence, the pursuit of gold amidst the textiles, arts, and architecture of Jodhpur. And joining us today is art historian Pramod Kumar KG. Welcome, everyone. Before I hand over to Swati from the Art of Gold, a few quick instructions. We will be posting the bio of today's speaker, the full bio, in the chat box that you see at the bottom of your screen. Next to the chat box is the Q&A box. Please post your questions in the Q&A box. With that, over to you, Swati.
Thank you. Hello all, and a very good evening to all of you. On behalf of the Art of Gold, I would like to welcome you all here today. I would like to extend our welcome and our appreciation to Raghu of Bangalore International, Mortimer Chatterjee and Tara Lal of Chatterjee and Lal, Sharan Apparao and Rupa Sood of the Yarn Club, Karni Singh Jasol, the director of Mehrangarh Museum, and his team from the Mehrangarh Museum Trust, and Pramod KG from Eka Resources for being a part of this initiative. Pramod will be talking about the unbroken history of the Jodhpur royal family collections and the extensive use of gold that he has observed and studied about in them. Over to you, Pramod.
Evening, everyone. A very good evening or a good day, depending on whichever part of the world you are in. A luminous presence, the pursuit of gold amidst the textiles, arts, and architecture of Jodhpur is a subject that came to me fairly late because I'm not a conventional host of a scholar of working with Jodhpur. I've done most of my work in Rajasthan at Jaipur and Udaipur. Amidst the glories of the rich material culture, one aspect that is seldom remarked upon is the complex's extensive use of gold and gilt. This talk explores the application of gilt across the complex, from its buildings to its rich holding of paintings, object art, costumes, and textiles. The case for Jodhpur in its use of gilt is to try and understand why one of India's best kept museums, the Mehrangarh Fort Museum, and studied collections has not had much attention paid to a material that gleams literally off every surface. The museum's unrivaled collection of historic paintings, textiles, material culture across several media shall provide a visual anchor for this talk. I also fervently hope to be able to draw focus to the lack of attention made to the study of materiality across the arts of India, both past and present. In my work as a curator archivist looking at India's material culture, I'm surprised that while the visual arts and slowly some of the other plastic art forms are being examined with greater attention, we seem to have lost a focus on the varied kinds of materials that are seen all around us. Wood, stone, glass, ivory, even textiles are currently amidst the purview only of style, date, and a region. So it was a pleasant surprise when the Art of Gold approached me and explained their pursuit of gold within the textile arts of India. While accepting the offer to speak, I also broached the subject that this presentation would revel around a lot of other gilt-laden material, and to my surprise, they accepted the request with alacrity. I have therefore firstly to thank Swati and Sunaina of the Art of Gold for making this project happen. I also need to thank Zaisha and Mayank Mantingkal for their wonderful stewardship of this project, Culture Bag, the Yarn Club for their support, and finally to Raghu Tenkalia at the Bangalore International Center for having created perhaps the most dynamic platform of the BIC streams for talks like mine, especially in times of the pandemic. In the midst of August 2014, I had gone down to Jodhpur at the invitation of the Mehrangarh Museum to see their photography archives. And at the end of the 2-day visit, as I left Jodhpur, I had a brief word with Karni Singh Jasol, the museum's director. I distinctly recall speaking to him and mentioning that I was surprised at the museum's prevalence of gold and gilt across almost all surfaces in the complex, rarely in profusion, never too much, but always, always as a brilliant highlight that made me pause and wonder, why was this aspect of Jodhpur not spoken about? The thought remained exactly that, a thought, until the query to speak today came by. Life was made much easier by the plethora of brilliant books that the Mehrangarh Museum has released over the years, specialist volumes talking about the different aspects of its material culture, and consequently, most of the images you see here are from the museum. I have to thank Karni Singh, the museum's director, his colleagues, Sunaina, and everyone else who patiently and efficiently answered all my queries. My thanks are also due to Neil Greentree in the US, who has spent the last decade visiting and shooting Jodhpur, Mehrangarh, and its collection. His photography has helped me with incredible exterior views as what you see on the screen now, and many of the objects that you see in the museum's collection during the presentation were also captured by him. The Mehrangarh Fort rises nearly 400 feet off the plains that make the city of Jodhpur. The name itself means the Fort of the Sun, a reference to the clan's mythical descent from the sun god Surya, which is apt for our talk today. The sun that in its light allows us to see the glint of colors and textures is what you see across the fort. Never the same as the sunlight changes and moves across the horizon, a glimpse of gold varies. Rao Jodha, the city's eponymous founder, began building the fort in the late 15th century, taking advantage of its spectacular location. Though regional rivalries were to take its toll at first over the coming century for both the local Rajput kingdoms and the approaching Mughals who were coming into the subcontinent. Most of us in modern India, where Mughal is almost a bad word increasingly, fail to understand that across the subcontinent, the rule of the Mughals was in effect managed with the help of powerful courtiers, and one of the most important components of this rule were the Rajput rulers of Rajasthan. Here, what you see in the earlier slide, the Sheesh Mahal is one of the oldest parts of the palace within the Mehrangarh Fort from the early 18th century. The Phool Mahal that comes after that was built by Maharaja Abhay Singh, and this is from the mid 18th century. As you can see, the profusion of gilt and gold decorations across the building's ceiling, on the walls, and also on the marble and the stone pillars that adorn the building. Some more details from the Phool Mahal ceiling. Now we're at the Moti Mahal, where again, the enormously decorated ceiling with the use of gilt glass and mirror gives a spectacular effect to the room. A few of these rooms have to be really experienced by sight and by visit to really get the magic of how the gold comes through in all of these formations. The Takhat Vilas from the mid-19th century is actually quite a remarkable room for its size. Its decorations include paintings all across the complex, and what is really interesting in these painted surfaces is the use of folk art along with high art as we know it now. So it's quite a remarkable structure. What is additionally interesting here is that we still have a lot of folk depictions within the paintings, including folk tales like the episode of the story of Dhola and Maru. We now move to a very important part of the use of gold in the court at Jodhpur because of their background and the connection with the Mughal Empire from the 16th century onwards. What you see here are some of the more important courtiers from Jodhpur, who are rulers of Jodhpur, but were courtiers of the Mughal court in New Delhi. A defining moment, which is again often eclipsed in popular narrative, except for scorn sometimes, is the fact that Rajput princesses, time and again, were the empresses of Hindustan following their marriage to the Mughal emperors. While the alliance began with Akbar, we must remember that Jahangir and Shah Jahan both had Rajput mothers, and Jahangir's consort Jodha Bai also known as Jagat Gosai, was in fact a princess of Marwar. This goes against the popular narrative promoted by Bollywood that Jodhabai was Akbar's wife, which is not true. Jodhabai was actually the princess of Jodhpur. The next emperor, Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan, was therefore a son or grandson of Jodhpur. And this is important not just for the power and prestige, but because it is for the experience of being part of the Mughal polity that gave the rulers of Marwar an exposure to a world far outside their realms. All these three paintings are imperial commissions which were made at the Mughal court. And as you can see, the rulers were significantly part of the albums that were being created. And it is for sure that many of them had an opportunity to see their own portraits and to realize and imbibe the high culture that was existing in the region. While being a member of the Mughal court meant being involved in warfare across the realm far from home, this also meant exposure to the finest arts and crafts of the time. And over the 16th century, this worldview was to tremendously shape the patronage of arts in Marwar. The images you see are consequently an ode to enlightened patronage, an ever-expanding physical and mental horizon, and an ability to add nuance, our filter for the use of gold across media. What you see here are images now succeeding. The next 6-7 slides are images from the incredible manuscript well known to most of us as the Patshanama, which is the Royal Collection Trust at Windsor. The reason I've chosen a few of these paintings is to try and explain the connection of the experience of being a Mughal polity that affected and helped create the arts and crafts of Marwar to some extent. The gentleman circled here is Raja Surat Singh Rathore. The Mughals had a very, very strict hierarchical principle of how paintings created the levels of intimacy between the emperor. Here you see Emperor Jahangir, his son Prince Khurram, who subsequently becomes the Emperor Shah Jahan. I hope the views are clear to everyone. And one of the most consequential 17th century archives in the public realm is the painted illustration of the Patshanama, now in the Queen's collection at Windsor Castle. They offer us an unparalleled view of the insight of Mughal polity. And if we were to put away our focus on the emperor for one mere moment, several people show up. The paintings of this imperial manuscript of Shah Jahan is nothing short of a who's who of 17th century North India. The hierarchy of the present nobles in these paintings are strictly allotted as per court protocol and norms. And this is where we see a splendid range of personages from Jodhpur. We now see a close-up. Sorry, just having a bit of technical difficulty. The folios of the Patshanama that I have chosen are important because these are the folios where the rulers of Jodhpur are very prominently shown. Here you see the ruler of Jodhpur at court right below the emperor and his son. And what is also incredibly amazing for us to see is the beginning of seeing to see the ruler of Jodhpur adorned in gold. You see these small bead gold necklace which he's wearing, which is possibly a remnant of the campaign at Bijapur that he was part of with Prince Khurram then, or who becomes the future ruler Shah Jahan. You see an incredible gold pendant he wears, and just see the highlight of gold on his white garment. This painting, one of the most important, is of Shah Jahan's accession ceremonies. And you see his three eldest sons and Asaf Khan in the frame. But what's equally important for us is the present. Do remember that Gaching Rathore, again, is the brother of Shah Jahan's mother, and his place in court was very prominent, and he's in the direct line of sight of the emperor. So again, hierarchy is giving you a clear sense of what's going on. But more importantly for us, we have to understand that at this point, the rulers of Marwar are being exposed to what is the finest product. Yeah. We now go to another folio where you see Shah Jahan honoring his son, Prince Darashikoh at his wedding in 1633. And here again, you have a brilliant scene whereby Raja Gat Singh Rathore, who is the uncle of the emperor um, and the granduncle of the young groom, is on the same level as the emperor. This again signifies their importance at court, but do also pay attention to the incredible gilt clothes that the ruler from Marwar is wearing. As you start slowly seeing a progression in the impact of gold that is worn by the rulers with their increasing proximity coming in. The reason for highlighting this continues because this is the time where in Shah Jahan's court by 1633, we have an incredible folio showing the arrival of Europeans bringing in gifts from the outside world, in this case from the Far East. And here you see the black box one of these gentlemen is holding is now being proven to have been a Japanese lacquer box that was being brought. So here, Raja Gat Singh Rathore of Jodhpur is in the Mughal presence, but also observing the best of material produce that can be brought from any part of the world. And he's part of this incredible atmosphere, allowing him to expand his horizons, not just physically and metamorphically, but also to understand the levels of patronage that is possible. And this is something he carries back to his kingdom of Marwar. Here you see the departure of Prince Shah Shuja for Kabul. This is one of the rare paintings where we've got three different people from the Marwar court shown on the painting. We move away from the Mughal court for a brief moment and we come to the early 18th century, which is when we start seeing a distinct style of painting coming together in Jodhpur. And here we see the Mahi Maratib, or the fish standard, which is used in procession. Some of the earliest paintings depicting gilt come from this time period in Jodhpur, and these were clearly made by artists who were aware of the kind of artworks that were being created. The gilt head fish, or the fish standard, the Marimatal, has a large textile backdrop which comes right behind the head of the fish. And when wind blows through it, the textile expands, giving this entire shape to a great prominence. Do remember that the use of the fish standard was given by the Mughal emperors earlier, but the fish was also considered fairly important, because if you had the fish standard, it meant that you were independent and you were not under the overlordship or the suzerainty of anyone else. The fish was also used as the insignia because a fish was one of the few animals that could not be controlled. By 1725, the remarkable paintings coming through in Jodhpur show the hand of Mughal artists and some kinds of training which clearly were being traversed back and forth. And here, while you have a painting made in Jodhpur by the artist Dalchand, you realize that the incredible depth of detail shows his training at the Mughal court and the wonderful atmosphere he's able to carry. From the earlier paintings that you show of the Padshahnama, now you're beginning to see some of the accoutrements at the Mughal court, but made in a different style and a fashion that are now being used at the court at Jodhpur. Similarly, we continue with Dalchand's artwork and we come to amazing portraits where the rulers are out on an evening stroll on horseback with their assistants holding on to kiranis. The standard that you see held behind the ruler is a gilt-laden textile standard, which is used to protect the ruler from any kind of sunlight. Hence the name of it being called Kirania, or the sun catcher. The importance of gold was increasingly being understood by the painters at court, because here you see the ruler paying homage to Lord Krishna, but the ruler has no gold on him. The absence of gold also conveys the kind of heft that was given to the use of gold. And when you were paying allegiance to your overlord, to the god, it was fit only to cover the gods with gold and to leave the ruler in much humbler clothing. Whereas the jar with the holy water, which is going to be sprinkled, shows great levels of gilt coming onto it. We now move to more detailed paintings where the use of gold across the textiles and accoutrements are far more clearer. These kinds of tented textiles, floor spreads, pillows, cushions, and other objects are continuously seen from the 18th century onwards amongst the plastic arts of Jodhpur. The paintings depicting textiles are a large part of the collection at Jodhpur. And here you have the wonderful image of Maharaja Ajit Singh presenting a garland to his son, Bhagat Singh. But this is actually a very interesting portrait because Bhagat Singh had actually killed his father. And this image was recreated to sort of proclaim his legitimacy to the throne. And the honoring of the son by the father with a garland was supposed to symbolize his legitimacy. Do notice the elaborate ties of the gold on the ruler's angrakhi. We now come to an important court painting, the coronation of Maharaja Man Singh in the early 19th century. And here again, the profuse use of gold is seen. You see it on the body of the ruler as he's highlighted during the coronation ceremony, being given the holy mark by the chief priest at court, and also the use of gilt textiles across. I want you to pay attention to these three windows and other windows across the complex, because when you visit the museum today, you're also likely to see some remnants of these wooden carved windows of Jodhpur, which have wood paint and overladen with gilt layers. We now move on to a detail from a larger painting from the Shiv Rahasya manuscript. And here we have the Lord Shiva shown. If any of you have seen the exhibition catalogs for the recent exhibitions of Jodhpur, you'll be familiar with many of these paintings. They have been depicted in great detail. The highlight of gold in the use of indigo blue gives you the sense of the moon clouds, as they are famously known from Jodhpur. We now move to more important paintings which show complex mythological series which are painted alongside philosophical treatises. This one in particular is from the Suraj Prakash manuscript, and it speaks of the genealogy and the genealogy of the rulers of Marwar from Lord Ram until the time of Jayachand of Kannauj, then they claim that they moved from Kannauj to Marwar in the 14th and 15th century. The extraordinary depiction of Lord Shiva with the amount of gilt used on it gives you a sense of how gold was being used as a highlight element to create drama, body, volume, and perspective in the paintings. We now come to an extraordinary painting which shows the festivities of Sharat Purnima at Marwar at Mehrangarh Fort. This is a festivity celebrated at full moon, under the full moon light, and this is in the beginning of winters. The structure which is shown is the Moti Mahal, which is an image that you saw earlier in the presentation, and you can see the gilt levels across the painting. The members of the court are all dressed in white, silver, and gold, and you see the Maharaja in three different positions. You see him outside in the courtyard, you see him go up into a slightly more enclosed space, and finally towards the end of the evening you see him in private audience with women of the court at the rooftops of the building. Similarly, across 19th century, you see the prevalence of the use of gold across a lot of material. You see the thrones that are being created. Here we have Maharaja Man Singh in a garden pavilion out there with ladies of the court, and the objects that you see, many of these are seen across Palace Museum collections in North India. Some of the shapes are generic, but variations of these exist, and I hope to show a few of them to you as we go through. This painting by Ali of Maharaja Takht Singh and ladies of the royal court on a hunt is quite remarkable for the way it's an evening with a lot of thunder and lightning, and the highlights of gold added with a bit of copper tinge to give it a bronzish look is what really makes this painting come alive. And at the same time, the palpable sense of movement among the audience, amongst the people shown in the painting is really what the hint of gold highlights comes through to me. In fact, many of the paintings across the collection of the palace show very, very similar highlights. What is important in this painting is that right now we are beginning to see the coming of gifts into the Jodhpur court. This was an important painting that came in to Jodhpur when the Harda conference was held in the early 18th century amongst the rulers of Jaipur, Jodhpur, and Udaipur, when they decided to tie up and build an alliance against the central court at Mughals of the Mughals. And this brings us to a very interesting point, because it is at the Mughal court that the use of a red tent is considered the greatest privilege. And we are told that during the Harda conference, Emperor Muhammad Shah took offense to the use of a red tent by the rulers of Jodhpur. Now, is he referring to the Lal Dera, which is one of the most famous Mughal tented textile pieces that we still have in India, and this remains at Jodhpur Fort? It's much celebrated. This installation view that you see is from an exhibition in 1985-86, which was done at the Met in New York. This shows the tent in its greatest complexity. These tents have subsequently been shown in the very different shows. Each side of the tent measures nearly 7.5 meters, with the inner court that you see here also, which is an exact square of 3.5 meters, with the maximum height going up to 4 meters in the center, which would be about 12 to 14 feet. What is remarkable about this textile is the use of a single color silk velvet, most probably woven in Ahmedabad, because we think that was the major center from most 17th century accounts of Mughal tented textiles come from Ahmedabad. And the velvet embroidered with thick gold thread is really what has been used across this remarkable textile. It's a very dense and an even application, and large flowering plant patterns are seen on the back wall. The similarly patterned top of the tent, the canopy is also visible here. Different lights give you a different sense of it. On the canopy, the indigo is slightly better preserved, whereas if you go at other examples of the base of the tent, you see that the indigo has faded to a raw turquoise color. The use of other tented textiles in the Jodhpur court are manifest with the numerous examples that exist. This is a very remarkable tent piece that we have from the court. It's a huge fragment from a larger hanging, and this exceptional metal ground pattern textile with flowers and a floral lattice is woven in the complex structure of taquit and samit, and they probably belong to the group of metal ground silks woven in Ahmedabad at the Imperial Karkhana. We are aware that Ahmedabad was one of the major centers, and we assume that these textiles came in from Ahmedabad. More richly embroidered velvet, gilt metal thread, and sequined tented textile pieces remain in the court. These are again fairly large. While the design aesthetics are from the 17th and 18th century, what is increasingly happening now is that the sizes and scale of the artworks is changing. So what would have been a slightly more sparser design is now becoming a more heavy and an ornate design. Yet the skill and the use of gilt metal threads is very important. What's really interesting is that we have not been able to literally pinpoint the regions from where the gilt metal thread was being imported or was being brought into these regions during the use of these textiles, during the use of these textiles and during the manufacture of these textiles. We assume that some of it was probably from the western regions of India and maybe some from the north, but much more research still needs to be done in some of these areas. We now come to something quite remarkable, a baradri from the 19th century, a baradri or a portable garden pavilion, which is used to recreate court settings in a slightly more informal and relaxed manner, is a four-sided pavilion with 3 lobed arches that make up the 12 or the bara sides of the complex. These most permanent structures were also used throughout the palaces. While they were made of marble and sandstone, temporary baradris of this kind were fairly popular. The ease and the manner of removing them and taking them from side to side made them very popular at court. And many garden paintings show the use of such baradris. You can see the rich layer of gold leaf on the entire panels of wood. A remarkably large collection of Krishna Jhula or swings exist within the collection of the Mehrangarh Fort Museum. Most of them were cradles for royal infants, while others were for the Lord, in this case, Lord Krishna. Remarkably elaborate examples exist throughout Rajasthan. In many temples, private collections, we see similar jhulas. But what's again really interesting is that we are still not fully sure about the place of manufacture for these jhulas. The painting on the left shows you how these were in use, and it gives you a very clear indication of how prevalent it was through the courts and in private temples and shrines across Rajasthan. Some parts of Gujarat too seem there are instances where people have said that these were possibly made in Gujarat, but till conclusive proof comes by, we still have to wonder where some of these wonderfully gilded objects were being created. So surviving examples of wooden accoutrements decorated with gilt, throne settings of some rulers, and many others are shown, are really seen across paintings. What you see here is a throne which is a much later thing from the late 19th century, mid to late 19th century. Earlier paintings usually depict the rulers seated at the floor level with other courtiers, with the exception of a few cases where the ruler sought to sit at a slightly elevated platform. The Mahadol on the right, which is a grand palanquin, has a much more interesting story of its arrival in Jodhpur, and it is believed to have been captured by Maharaja Abhay Singh from the Mughal governor of Gujarat in the early 18th century. The Mahadol would have needed nearly 12 people to move the palanquin from side to side. And the hooks that you see on the tops would probably accommodate textile trappings which would be hung in case the Mahadol was being used by women of the royal court. You continue to see the use of palanquins and gilt-laden textiles, which are used as covers for these. Most of these pieces are fairly intact in Jodhpur. In fact, Jodhpur has a very large collection of palanquins. I've just highlighted two of them. One which is entirely covered in textile from Varanasi from the early 20th century. The fringes are fairly new. The shine of the yellow of the gold gives you a good indication of its time period. And again, I must remark that while the pattern is reminiscent of older jal patterns, what you see here is that the jals have become far more decorative and ornate, and the scale of the motifs have changed. This gives it a rather peculiar scale, but by the late 19th and early 20th century, that is what you see. Other palanquins continue with their painted wooden exteriors and interiors, and you see a heavy profuse use of gilt on the wooden surfaces. The legacy of unstitched cloth across India was fairly important. On the left, you have a Odhana or the veil, which is completely printed with gilt metal thread tinsel. And you also see gilt metal thread woven on the sides and on the rims of the textiles. The turban cloth on the right of the screen are all examples of men's turban cloths. Most of them are printed in resist dye, some in a tie-dye pattern, and museums across the world have a profuse number of these textiles showing varying levels of use of gilt and gold on it. Again, this tradition continues to date, and turbans are a very important part of the culture at Jodhpur and other parts of Rajasthan. We now come to seeing some of the textiles from the late 19th century that have survived. Do remember that older textiles that survive are largely tented textiles, which are used for court functions, events, canopies, wall hangings, and the like. And here what we see are textiles born as costumes. In this particular case, you have an achkan, which is again a creation of the late 19th century. This particular piece is fairly important because along with the silk gold embroidered textile garment, you also see the use of metallic fringe added on to the garment to give it a greater three-dimensionality and a theatrical look. the young Maharaja Sardar Singh's image that you see, he wears a very similar garment, though the brocade that he uses in his garment in the photograph is actually an imported silk. The textile that you see here is probably from India. We're not sure if it's from Gujarat or from Varanasi, but this again is from the late 19th century. The use of sequins and gilt embroidery is fairly profuse and prominent across the garment. The use of gilt textiles didn't necessarily mean that they were only meant for special occasions. They were also used for everyday wear. The skirt or the ghagra that you see on the left is a clear example of that. The young Princess Jodhpurs that you see on the right of the screen, again, is an early 20th century textile with embroidery being put across the bottom rim of the openings of the feet. And it's very interesting that many of these hybrid textile styles were also part of court culture in the late 19th century, and they didn't really come up much earlier. A lot of adaptations that we continue to see comes from these textiles. A very remarkable textile at the collection of Mehrangarh is this embroidered crepe silk sari. What's really remarkable is that the entire sari is festooned with cutouts of portraits of the Maharajas of Jodhpur. So the young lady or the royal lady who wore this textile clearly had the Maharaja's protection all across her when she was wearing the sari. It's a very remarkable textile. I know of only one or two other examples that survive showing photographic insets within textiles of this kind. What's really remarkable is the profuse use of embroidery in the extremities of the textiles. And this metal embroidery is both in gold and silver, alluding to the concept of the Ganga Jamuni, which is the silver and the gold which comes together in many of these cases. We now move to a slightly different area of the collection, which is the Arms and Armory collection, which has a lot of very interesting early examples of velvet with embroidered stump work. Stump work is the raised platform that you see on these textiles. The gilt embroidery is over the raised wadding or stuffing that is done on the velvet ways. This purse and the powder flask is fairly important. And we don't have too many examples of this from anywhere else in the world. Again, two more examples from the collection. Quite remarkable to see such early textiles used and in application on other surfaces. The shield that you see on the left is based on a style which was usually offered as a ceremonial shield, which was sometimes given to shrines to protect the warrior from harm. This shield on the left that you see, which is completely covered in silk with flat gilt bullion tape, really gives you an understanding of the profuse use of gilt across the court at Jodhpur. Here you see some remarkable examples on the dahals and the shields. The one on the left again is important because we think it was probably made in Lucknow and probably for one of the Delhi darbars of the late 19th and early 20th century. The piece on the right is slightly different. I want you to pay attention to the ivory which has been embossed with gold and the iron fretwork which is below it, and also the profuse use of gilting across, which seems to have gone off on the leather now, but you can get a sense of what it probably looked like. We think that this piece was used by Maharaja Takhat Singh. Detailed accounts exist within the armory of Mehrangarh of the maintenance and keeping of storekeeping. These includes names of makers, manufacturers, suppliers, and also the regions that many of these makers belong to. The advances of gold mohur for the use of blacksmiths to create armor and use the gold for decoration is something that we very commonly see across the records. If you look at the multiple volumes of Robert Elwood's work on the court arms of Jodhpur, a lot of beautiful examples are illustrated, depicted, and explained. However, the three pieces that you see here were made in Sialkot, which is now in Pakistan, but was in what was part of undivided Punjab. And this shows false gold damascene, and these were probably made as decorative pieces towards the late 19th century for a lot of new collectors. Do remember that major arts and crafts exhibitions occurred in England and in India during the late 19th century, and exhibitions of the crafts were part of these large functions, and collectors frequently acquired these pieces, and these are probably examples of the same kind. While the sword is called a Firangi Talwar because of the blade being of European make from the 17th century. The hilt is of the 18th century. And this brings us again to a very important point in understanding that towards late 19th century, as more and more pieces kept getting moved into the Mehrangarh stores, wherever pieces needed to be repaired and refixed, sometimes newer hilts were added to older blades. So it's very unlikely that you will come across an entire piece where the hilt and the sword are both of the same time period. What is really unique here is again the profuse ornamentation by gilt, which is being done in a very, very fine hand. And what's really interesting is that at the time of Maharaja Bijay Singh, we also have something called the Sona Rupare Jama Kharchi Bahi, which means the Bahi Khata, or the accounts of the use of gold in the armory, and it keeps track of the different kinds of gold which was given to use for creating patterns, to repairing objects, adding gilt on some of it, and also to engraving names in many of the pieces. Generally, gold sheeting was used, but other kinds of gold wire inlays were also prominent. A series of examples of the different kinds of gilt decoration, as you see in 18th and 19th century punch daggers, which is the Qatar. The matchlock rifle that you see here from Sindh has the name of the owner and the makers put in using gilt. This was also done much later sometimes. Again, unique arms. The Gupti in the left is a personal favorite. This was a walking stick with a sharp knife inside, which was concealed, hence the name Gupti. And if the ruler felt, or the person who was holding on to the Gupti felt he was in any danger, then the sword could be used for self-defense purposes. And you get to see the continued use. Symbology was very important. The elephant and the lotus bud, which is a symbol of the goddess, comes through here, and the goddess as the protector of the person holding on to the arm is fairly important. The khanjar that you see here is again an old Mughal piece. There is a similar piece at the Al Sabah collection. You see the profuse gilting which was added to the hilt, which is from Punjab and from the late 19th century. So the base of this khanjar is from the early 17th century, whereas the hilt is again from the 18th century. And the seamless use of gilding across time period has meant that the piece has a fine look. We continue with some of the other more obsolete arms from the 18th century, which got out of use by the 19th century because more far powerful tools were being used at court. But again, the extraordinary use of gilding, the patterns, the reminiscence of a Mughal aesthetic, what became popular across northern India is seen in many of these examples. In some cases, we have a slightly more greater imported detail. This is fairly interesting. You have a makara biting a hare who is trying to escape, and the two quillions are tiger heads. The blade is a Persian blade from the late 19th century, and the hilt was probably made in Udaipur with extraordinary gilt flowers and foliage. The blue, that base that you see is an enameled base on the piece. For all of you familiar with the use of Tewa jewelry, it's interesting to see that there's a remarkable Tewa from Pratapgarh, which is a sword which is seen in the armory at Jodhpur. There's a similar piece in the Queen's collection at Windsor Castle as well. This is again from the late 19th century, and the guard here has got the name of the Maharaja of Pratapgarh incised using the Tewa process. What is currently seen in the market is fairly decorative and used for more examples which are relevant to jewelry making. But in the early parts of the 19th century, when Tewa was being created and showcased for the first time, most of the pieces it was used for were decorative objects of larger scale. The hilt of the sword is a rather unusual application. I come back to my favorite portrait of Raja Surat Singh Rathore, a Mughal painting of extraordinary quality. If you recall, I had mentioned the use of a simple head ornament that you see even in the Patshanama paintings where you see him. He's wearing a Qatar, he's rather holding a Qatar on his waistband, which is the punch dagger, and similar Qatars exist in the collection. This one is probably from Bijapur from 1675, that is the late 17th century. We know that the Marwar rulers had been part of the assault on Bijapur, and we suspect that some of these pieces may have come from there. However, what's interesting is that the Sanskrit verses from the Ramayana were added much later in about the 1800s. We now come to an interesting phase when arms are being imported, not just from other parts of India, but from outside of the subcontinent, from outside of India, from Europe as well. Here you see the 54-bore revolver that has come in from Birmingham with gold decorations, which are added by Sir Pratap, the Maharaja of Idar, who was also multiple times the regent of Jodhpur and the chief minister at Jodhpur. You can see that his name has been added on using gilt application much later, whereas the earlier parts, whereas the plain simpler gold, the simpler revolver would have come in its earlier avatar, and the decorations were added much later. This again is a common feature across arms that you see. We take a slight diversion here and we look at the use of gilt objects in the rites of passage that happen across court, including important processional views. This is, of course, a view at Mehrangarh, the one that you see at top left, where there's a procession carrying the royal insignia, the elephant with the howdah being moved up the ramparts of the fort. Whereas at right, you have a view of the Peacocks in the Desert exhibition installation, whereby an entire procession was recreated for visitors to try and understand the use of horse and elephant jewelry and other royal insignia that was moved as part of the procession. This really gives you, you see gilt in play, you see gilt in motion, you see the use of gold in processional accoutrements. In some of the earlier paintings, you would have seen objects used at court which were fairly simple, and there were some others which are fairly we used a lot of gilt in them, and we've got two surviving examples. The one on the left is the betel nut box, the pandan, which holds betel leaves and other condiments that make part of the pan. This is again from Western India. The box on the right is a jewelry box, Manjusha from Punjab. A gold inlaid wire is steel here on the steel base. It's quite remarkable to see accoutrements of this kind. Do remember that post the collapse of the Mughal Empire in the 17th and 18th century, most of the treasures of the Mughals were dispersed and moved out. So we really don't have much track or provenance for many of the pieces that we see or what is claimed as High Mughal. In fact, to understand the material culture of the subcontinent from the 18th century onwards, you need to start looking at regional and provincial courts like the courts of Rajasthan to understand the making and movement of art objects. Many of these objects that are at court are really, because of the fact that they are at certain courts, we know that they have an unbroken provenance and a linkage from the past. Whereas what you see in many other collections are quite possibly not similar pieces. What you see here is an absolutely remarkable example of a water pipe base, this is actually the base of a hookah. This is from this early 18th century as the Umaid Bhavan Palace collection. What's really remarkable is the continuity in pattern using high Mughal floral motifs, which remained in fashion through the 18th and 19th century and are a hallmark of the design aesthetics prevalent at the time. But here there is a mystery. There is a reason why these elaborate gilt patterns were used across these objects. In the case of glass, particularly, we see that this was used very often to hide flaws in the glass. Glass making technology in these times was fairly early. Some of it was being made in Gujarat, particularly in Kutch. We are told that European manufacturers had come in and there were locals who had learned the art from Europeans and were creating glass. And the use of gilding was then very prominent and important because this allowed you to hide the flaws. What you see here are the flaws of the glass beautifully hid with the use of gilding and the application of color. One of my favorite pieces from the Jodhpur collection, this is of course at the Umaid Bhavan Palace. It's immense compendium, and it's a long walking stick which is made of steel with a covered with crocodile leather to the base of the piece, which is not visible. But this one piece holds several accoutrements within it. It is a walking stick. It is a watch. It's a whiskey flask. It holds a portrait of the ruler inside it. It's got a pillbox. It's a cheroot case holding 4 pieces of cheroot. It's a lighter. It's a pen knife. It has a pen and a pencil within it. Everything that a Maharaja would need is within his walking stick. One of the more remarkable survivals. The brass and the bronze used is then tinged with gilt all across the surface. This was, interestingly enough, made by Chunilal and Sons, a manufacturer from Jodhpur. In the late 19th and early 20th century, Jodhpur had manufacturers who were creating wonderful objects of art. In the metal tradition, and the making of arms continued to be a major art of the region. We now move to other imports that came in from America. In this case, this is a cord called SelfLoading Pistol, which is a gift from Maharaja Hanuman, a gift to Maharaja Hanuman Singh from his father, Maharaja Umaid Singh. And you see his name inscribed on the handle. The gift from 1943 has been inscribed on the piece. The beautiful case that was created, this was done by the dealer in Calcutta, from where the object was then supplied to the court at Jodhpur. The other cleaning accoutrements are visible within it, and also the brass and the gilt riveting of the box itself. Of course, several kinds of coins were being used in the court of Marwar, and here you see coins used and issued during the reign of Maharaja Jaswant Singh and Maharaja Sardar Singh in the late 19th and early 19th century. These coins, interestingly, have Shri Mataji always inscribed on them in reference to the protected divine goddess of the court. And the name of the ruler in Devanagari, sometimes in Persian, was inscribed. And in some cases, the name of Queen Victoria, her entire name was also inscribed on many of these coins. We now come to one aspect of the collection where gold, of course, is predominantly used, but I was trying to avoid my focus on it, is the use of the jeweled Temania. Do note that the Temania, which is common across Rajasthan, is perhaps a unique ornament from Jodhpur. This was a bit of information I got from my colleague and friend, Dr. Usha Balakrishnan, the leading jewelry historian of India. In conversation, she shared with me that she feels that the Temania is a uniquely Jodhpur object, which has now moved across the courts of Rajasthan and is prominent across the state. And it's quite interesting because we don't really see too many simple Temanias anymore. What you see are far more elaborate versions. The image on the left is from the National Museum's collection, whereby the one on the right is from a private collection overseas. What's interesting is that while we call it the Temania, different communities call it by different names. The Mahajans would call it the Mut, the Rajputs would call it the Ard or the Nimboli, whereas the Bishnois call it the Tegad or the Tegri, and the Rabadis call it the Ghungri, and the Jats also have a separate name called the Tevta. We now move to the early 20th century and the use of gilt at the Jodhpur court. This remarkable image from a private collection in Jaipur is of the Sodia Princess Krishna Kishore Kumarji or Kesar Kanwarbai, who was married to Maharaja Sardar Singh in the early 20th century. This is the painted photograph. The painted photograph is slightly enlarged, and then the photograph is enlarged and then heavily painted over by a court artist or a bazaar artist. The style is very reminiscent of the kind of work that was being used in the early 20th century. Do notice her elaborate Temania, as I spoke to you earlier about how it's become a much bigger piece of jewelry by now. The gilt that is seen across her textiles, across her jewelry, is fairly important. But the reason I show you this portrait is for a different reason altogether. I've also tried to match this with the costume in the court piece. This is definitely not the same textile. It is a different textile, but you get a sense of the poshak worn by Rajput women, the four-piece ensemble, which is very popular across Rajasthan and called the poshak, is what the lady in the portrait wears. And what you see interestingly here is that the lady is completely adored with jewelry, which shows her husband's image in different formats. I was able to nail this particular image with Maharaja Sardar Singh's official uniform photograph in a military costume. This is what you see here, whereas some of the other images that you see are based on these portraits. And we have a garment, Sherwani from the late 19th, early 20th century, which exists at the Jodhpur Mehrangarh collection, which shows a very similar pattern to this. So really the seamless coming together of the different parts of the collection, gilt being a common element, of course. Very few examples of this kind exist where you're able to match so many pieces together. And what's really remarkable at Jodhpur is that across the plastic and the material arts, you're able to connect textiles with gold, to photographs with gold, to paintings with gold, to jewelry pieces, to court accessories, to paintings, so on and so forth. And of course, finally, to the fantastic archive, the architecture that holds all of this in place. However, there is a defining image that everybody has of a collection, of an idea, of a moment. And from my visit to Jodhpur in 2014, what we were also prompted much later with was images of another kind, an image of another time, which was the early 19th century, when remarkable paintings were being created. What was called the dawn of the modernist world in other parts of the in other parts of the world was also happening in Jodhpur. And what I find as the most defining image for me is the three aspects of the absolute by the court artist Bulki. For me, the most defining image is this painting from the early 19th century. And Bulki goes into the deep philosophical roots of the Nath sect, its meanings, and the Mool Mantra that they hold sacred to them. The field of gold at the left, the extreme left, the plain field of gold, conveys the luminous absolute. In the center, the Nath Siddha represents the first manifestation of cosmos into form. And in the third, the Siddha exudes Jyoti or light, creating a consciousness. Explained lucidly by the art historian Deborah Diamond in our path-breaking exhibition and book, Garden and Cosmos, which was held at the Freer and Sackler at the Smithsonian. What's remarkable here is that the artist's choice of gold to define the absolute is perhaps a fitting place for us to conclude our talk today on the seminal place of gold at Mehrangarh. To use the most material of materials to explain immateriality was truly an inspired choice. The choice of gold to invoke the divine can be seen across wayside shrines and temples in India. These thoughts and provocations are perhaps very crucial in our understanding of the art of gold and its importance in India's material culture. This is really the takeoff point for me when I look at gold and I look at the art of gold in the region. Thank you.
That was a beautiful presentation, Pramod. It was, you've really taken our breath away. I think all of us are quite spellbound by this whole idea. And gold obviously is very important to everybody in India, even today. Now, looking at this entire collection and the importance of gold, you brought it. Is it the regality that actually brings the gold in at every stage, from the Mughals to here? Is it because it is precious and they want to use it everywhere? Is that what you see as a common thing that runs across the idea of wealth that comes through in this? Because it is the most precious metal.
Yes, for sure. It is the most precious material of the time. But what's also interesting is that it is sparingly used. At no point do you feel that the gold overtakes anything else. So the nuance of understanding the amount that needed to go in fact, in a simpler word, I would say almost all of the artists who worked across the multiple mediums where you see gold knew where to stop. There was no place where it went overboard. Clearly, it was also an expensive and a precious material, but there are very many instances where they could have gone overboard. But I find it quite remarkable that this regal material was used in such a brilliantly sparing manner, but also in such an effective manner to convey the idea that most people wanted to get of gold.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. I have one more question about the
Sure, sure.
sari with the photographs. Was
Yes.
it like an enamel piece or was it like a paper
No,
photograph?
so an applique cutout is created in the silk crepe, and physical photographs are cut out and inserted into it. So you can remove the photograph if the textile needed to be cleaned.
Goodness, that's really fabulous. Quite something.
Yeah.
Today, of course, we have our digital printing, but imagine in those days. And the photograph is there. It's prominent in everything, like all these pendants that they're wearing in the shield where you see the sun emblem that has been made on ivory. So the image of the ruler or the image of the deity, the image of Surya, because they're all Surya Vanshis, right?
They are
And
yes.
they come through quite a lot.
Absolutely. You see the preponderance of an imagery of the rulers coming in largely by the late 19th century. Earlier, symbolic references, iconographic references are more common. I would say that in the earlier paintings, perhaps even philosophical tenets and markers that were hidden and put into the painting or the visual imagery was fairly clear to the audience. They knew what was being conveyed. It is only in the late 19th and early 20th century, and now in hindsight, that we posit and put time periods or motives to many of these things. Whereas for them, earlier iconography was fairly clear. Do remember, and this is an important point, that till the coming of electricity, most of these places post the going down of the sun would be incredibly dark. And all the gilts that you saw across these mediums would only be seen by oil lamps or candlelight. So there would be a different kind of vibrancy that the gold would create within these complexes, within these palaces, in the use of gold, in the building, in the arms, in the textiles, in the decor, in the material culture. So that play is also fairly important.
Thank you. The subtlety comes through, obviously, in the subdued lighting. Thank you. I'll leave it to the other people to ask.
Thank you, Sharan. Thank you, Pramod. That was absolutely spectacular. We're now going to take questions from our audiences. I'm going to combine two questions. One from Dr. Rajni Prasanna, who asks about the technique of how the gold was applied on paintings and architecture and in other materials. Like, if you can speak a little bit about the techniques they used. Combined with a question from Deborah Diamond, who asks, what was the source of this gold?
So the known sources of gold currently, we definitely know that gold was being mined in Karnataka. We know of the Kolar mines as late as the 16th, 17th century as being a source. We know that there were mines in Rajasthan too. We've not been able to pinpoint exact sources of where these gold came. But if we were to get into metallurgical studies and we were to isolate examples of gold and were to when we were to test them in the labs, enough samples would allow us to aggregate and position which part of the country or area many of these gold fragments would have come from. So we know that most of it was from different parts of the country, but we're not in a position currently to pinpoint the exact part. We do think some bits of it was definitely imported, because we know from Roman times that they complained that the gold of Rome is being brought into India. In fact, you have a famous lament of Pliny the Elder, who says that the Indians won't trade for anything but for the supply of gold. So we have that historic account for sure. But much more work needs to be done for us to be able to identify and isolate the region where these gold came from. The other parts that we need to look at, especially the application of gold, the first question that you asked me about, the application techniques varied from material to material. In most cases, a kind of local variety of a gum arabica was used as a base or a binder onto which gold paste or gold paint, and in some cases gold sheeting or gold leaf was applied. This was a constant. Many layers would be used in certain places where you wanted greater impact. Many layers of gold leafing would be done, whereas in some places it would not be that extensive. Many times gold, a kind of a kind of lacquered finish was done over the gold plating to keep the piece in shine. This is what you particularly see in jeweled objects, but also in painting. Very importantly, poncing stones were used in painting to rub and make sure that the gold became part of the painting very much in the fabric. It was sort of pounded through the painting to completely make sure that it stayed on the surface. In fact, one of the reasons sometimes we have trouble conserving older paintings is because multiple kinds of artworks use multiple materials and all of them react to time and age differently. So when you're restoring a painting for its watercolors, you have to be careful that the gold layer doesn't come off. So these are the complexities. So this sort of varies across the use. And when you see the degree of damage or loss of gold on an object, that really gives you a better sense of what happened to the material.
Thank you, Pramod. The next question is from Shobha Narayan. She thanks you for this marvelous survey and asks, if you were to describe the aesthetic of this time, say in 5 words, what would they be?
Gosh, 5 words would be very difficult, but yeah, the aesthetics of the time is sublime, simple. Actually, those 2 words would really take, I mean, for me, those 2 would probably be what comes through in gold. And as I remarked in the beginning of my talk, in 2014, when I went to Jodhpur for the first time, for the first time to the Mehrangarh Museum to look at the collection, what really struck me was the use of gold. And I remember remarking to the now director of the museum, Karni, saying that, why does nobody talk about the gold? Why does nobody speak about it? And that is really the impetus for this. And when this opportunity to talk came through, I happily jumped onto it.
Thank you, Pramod. The next question is from Blandina Stanhauslin. She asks, where are all these textiles kept and can they be seen in normal times, of course?
Textiles are wonderfully fragile, difficult to keep, difficult to maintain, difficult to store, and most difficult to show. They are in the Mehrangarh stores. They're beautifully maintained and kept in storage. Most of them cannot be shown for longer periods than a few months. Even when they're taken for traveling exhibition, there is a time period of rest that needs to be given to them. Do remember that over time, the weight of the gold hangs over the other parts of the textile. So if you have a cotton base or a silk base, the metal thread or the metal embellishment has more weight and it pulls the textile down. Hence the importance of keeping the textiles very carefully preserved and saved. Conservation costs for textiles are also hugely expensive. So the viewing of textiles in most museums is limited, but thankfully Mehrangarh is one of the few museums where they're beautifully maintained and kept. And yes, scholars and students constantly have access to it. It's one of the few collections in India which has allowed its imagery to go across the world. It has taken multiple exhibitions out of India to the world to show their collections, to show their art and craft. And in that sense, I think it's an example to other museums in the country that it is only when you share and you show that you are able to create a greater depth of study, information, knowledge on the arts of the country. Yes.
Yeah. The next question is from Zohra Chatterjee, and it's related to a point that you mentioned in your previous response. Agra and Lucknow are still centers of gold and metal thread embroidery. Kachob and Zardozi and pieces, perhaps, she's speculating, could they have been sourced from Lucknow and Agra and from that region?
For sure, we know that after the decline of the Mughal Empire, when Lucknow became a fairly important place where the patronage of the arts continued, a lot of workers moved to these provincial courts. Some moved to Jaipur when the city was created in the early 18th century. Some moved to Jodhpur for sure. Some would have gone to other centers. Lucknow, we know, was a major center for textile embroidery, and we are very sure that many pieces would definitely have come from those regions. I may not have particularly pointed out to any one of them, but yes, there are textiles that have come from Lucknow, and all the different textile techniques of embellishment that she has mentioned are prevalent across the collection at Jodhpur. You see them in the very textiles of the collection.
The next question is from Sneha Patwardhan, and she asks, like gold, did they have any preferences for diamonds and precious stones, which equals the sort of use of gold yeah.
So I would hesitate to say that diamonds and other precious material equaled the use of gold at court, but for sure they exist. We have remarkable photographs from the late 19th, early 20th century which show important personages from the court, the rulers, the extended families wearing precious jewelry adorned with diamonds and other precious stones. But the scale would remain much more smaller. It would remain for objects that were made for the body, which are meant to be adorned, and in some cases for arms for sure, and a few examples I did show through the talk. But largely the use of gold was probably much more than the use of the other precious and semi-precious stones.
Nafisa Tanawala asks the question about the sari that you showed us in your presentation. Were the portraits of how was that portrait actually made? Was it a photograph, or was it a painted miniature that was inserted into the sari?
Into the sari, all of them are photographs. They are photographs of 19th and early 20th century, and in some cases they are photographs of paintings that exist which are based on photographs. So across the sari, every insert is a photograph.
We have tons and lots of
Sure.
comments on how great the the presentation is. So I think we'll take 2 more questions, which is so we perhaps the last question. Are there any parallels to the Mehrangarh collection in other princely states? And do any other sort of princely states have the same a collection that can parallel this current collection that you just showed us?
Important collections certainly exist in other princely courts across India, and now in Hyderabad, for example, has some. There is some in Jaipur. There are other smaller courts. I'm sure Mysore itself has a large collection as well. We see it from time to time, especially during the processional ceremonies of Dasera, when you see a lot of court accoutrements coming out. But yes, examples do exist in other places. Jodhpur is uniquely placed over some of the others because very early on, it went into a very systematic process of documentation and archiving of its collection. It allowed for scholars to come, visit, study, photograph. It allowed for visuality and imagery to go out. It allowed for extraordinary books to be published, which shared the wealth of knowledge and information with the larger public, and hence more scholarship went into it. Most of the others are practicing this now increasingly, but Jodhpur really took the lead in doing something of the scale. And in fact, most of my work in this talk was fairly easy for me because of these publications that existed. Do remember, I'm not a scholar of Jodhpur. My work and expertise in Rajasthan particularly is at Jaipur and Udaipur. My other areas of specialization are 19th century photography and textiles. But in this case, it was the element of gold that made me come through and look at this across the arts of one particular court. And so yes, to answer your question once again, yes, other collections do exist, and I've given a few names, and I'm sure there are other collections that will be made available slowly as time goes by.
Okay, I have one comment and one last question. This is from, okay, I don't know, it's an anonymous comment. The use of gold carries forward in Stefan Norblin's murals in Umaid Bhawan Palace, the Polish artist who designed some parts of the interiors of Umaid Bhawan. Bravo, Pramod, this has been riveting. I think this is Mayank, so.
I don't think it's mine. I think I know who it is. But anyway, that's not the point. But yes, Stefano Noblin's Art Deco works, paintings, particularly inside the Umaid Bhawan Palace, are really remarkable. I purposely I did struggle with the choice of wanting to show a few of those images, but then I kept wanting to keep my focus to the court at Mehrangarh before the shift happened in the early 20th century to Umaid Bhawan Palace. And do remember that for most practical purposes, Umaid Bhawan is a hotel and continues partly to be the residence of the royal family. So Mehrangarh is, of course, the more accessible public collection that everybody can see, enjoy, and appreciate.
Yeah. The last question is again a technical question. This is from Sanchita Dasgupta. Did they also use raised gold curry painting on panels and clothes? Is her question.
Raised gold, we see painting for sure in some of the architectural rooms. We see slight usage of gesso plaster, which is then covered with gilt. So you have a sort of three-dimensional raised effect that comes in there. In textile, I showed you a couple of velvet-covered powder kegs, which had stump work. So those are raised with cotton padding or with board padding, which are then embroidered, subsequently giving it a three-dimensional raised effect on it. So yes, there are examples in some of the pieces.
So I think with that, we've addressed more or less all the questions. So thank you, Pramod, again for this absolutely fascinating and glittering walk through this remarkable, expansive and invaluable collection of the Mehrangarh Museum. We are also grateful for your work and hope this session sparks imaginations to study and preserve more of this kind of cultural wealth. Thank you as always to our partners who have made this presentation possible. And thank you audiences for joining us today.
Thank you.